When we think about the 20th century, our minds often jump to the massive world wars, right? But that's really only half the story. It was also a century defined by these incredible movements within nations and empires, everyday people who stood up, challenged authority, and demanded change. So let's dive into that often overlooked side of history, the story of global resistance.
And that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. I mean, think about it. If you're up against a massive colonial empire, a totalitarian state, or a system that's just deeply unfair, what do you even do? How do you possibly fight back and make your voice heard?
So here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start with the big picture, the struggle against authority. Then we'll get into how some leaders turned peace into a powerful weapon. From there, we'll look at the incredibly risky business of resisting the Soviet Union. We'll also see what happens when protest turns to rage, how the state strikes back with its own power, and finally, we'll wrap it all up to see what this century of struggle really teaches us.
Yeah, so the 20th century was really this constant dynamic push and pull. On one side, you had these huge established power structures. We're talking governments, empires, the whole shebang. And on the other side, you had all these different groups of people pushing back, demanding everything from independence to basic human rights.
But here's the thing. Resistance didn't always mean picking up a gun. In fact, one of the most revolutionary ideas of the century was that peace itself could be a weapon. A whole new generation of leaders came along and proved that nonviolent action could be an incredibly powerful way to make real, lasting political change. And you can really see this idea ripple across the world. You could say the modern story of nonviolence really kicks off with Mohandas Gandhi in India. His whole strategy of civil disobedience, using things like marches, boycotts, and hunger strikes, was what ultimately forced the British Empire to grant India independence in 1947. That was huge, and that idea inspired leaders everywhere, like Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States. His use of nonviolent protest, especially the March on Washington, created so much pressure that it led directly to the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And then, a bit later, you have Nelson Mandela, who became this global icon of that same determined, powerful resistance in his long fight against apartheid in South Africa. We're talking 3 different continents, 3 huge struggles, all driven by this one powerful idea.
Okay, but what happens when you're not resisting a faraway empire, but a massive superpower that's literally right next door? Well, over in Eastern Europe, the fight for a little bit of freedom from the Soviet Union looked very, very different. And often, it was tragic.
This slide is fascinating because it shows 2 stories from the exact same year, 1956. In Poland, the leader Władysław Gomułka walked this incredibly fine line. He managed to get some independent policies through, but was very careful to stay allied with the USSR. And it worked, kinda. He got a little autonomy. But then you look at Hungary. Their leader, Imre Nagy, went all in. He declared full independence, free elections, and said they were leaving the Warsaw Pact. The result? A massive Soviet invasion, and Nagy was executed. It just shows you the razor's edge these countries were on.
And this wasn't a one-off thing. We saw the same pattern play out again. In 1968, you had the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. The leader, Alexander Dubček, started introducing more freedoms, a more open society. But that dream of socialism with a human face was completely crushed under the treads of Soviet tanks.
And this wasn't just the Soviets being bullies on a whim. They actually gave it a name, the Brezhnev Doctrine. It was a bone-chillingly simple policy. It basically said that Moscow had the right to invade any of its socialist allies if it felt they were stepping out of line and threatening the whole communist project. It was the official justification for snuffing out any spark of independence.
All right, so we've talked about peaceful protest and careful political moves. But that wasn't the whole story. Not by a long shot. As the century went on, especially around the late 60s, a whole different kind of energy started to build. One that was a lot less about patience and a whole lot more about rage.
And just look at how global this feeling was. The year 1968 was like a flashpoint all over the world. You had students protesting in Yugoslavia, religious protests in Poland, workers demanding rights in Brazil. In Japan and the US, there were huge protests against the Vietnam War. And in France, wow, student protests literally exploded into a general strike of 10 million people. It was like a dam had broken, and this new, more confrontational spirit was just everywhere.
But for some, even these massive protests felt like hitting a brick wall. They became convinced that the system was totally broken and would never listen. So they made a grim decision. They turned to a much more extreme tactic: terrorism.
deliberately targeting civilians to create fear and force political change.
And the human cost was just devastating. In Northern Ireland, during the period known as the Troubles, groups like the IRA clashed with opposing paramilitaries and the state. Between 1969 and 1994, that conflict took the lives of about 3,500 people.
And as devastating as that was, in other parts of the world, the numbers were even more horrifying. In Peru, a Maoist group called the Shining Path launched a campaign of terror in 1980 to try and overthrow the government. Their actions led to the deaths of around 37,000 people.
And by the time the century turned, terrorism had truly gone global. The attacks on September 11, 2001, carried out by the international group Al-Qaeda, killed over 3,000 people in the U.S. and showed the world that no country was safe from this kind of political violence.
So that leads us to the other side of this whole equation. When states were faced with all these challenges, peaceful movements, political defiance, violent uprisings, how did they react? Well, as you can probably guess, it was often with overwhelming, brutal force.
And here are two really grim examples. You have Francisco Franco in Spain, whose anti-communist regime went after hundreds of thousands of its own people over decades. And then there's Idi Amin in Uganda, who earned the nickname the Butcher of Uganda. He was responsible for up to 500,000 deaths, using state power to whip up ethnic hatred and just wipe out anyone he saw as an enemy.
But where does all this state power come from? Well, back in 1961, a really surprising person gave a pretty stark warning about it. It was the U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower, a former five-star general who told his own country to beware of what he called the military-industrial complex. So what he was getting at was this really dangerous triangle forming between a country's own military, its government, and the private companies that make and sell weapons for profit. He was worried that this powerful combo would get so influential that it would basically create a permanent reason to go to war, which could threaten the very democracy it was supposed to be protecting.
Okay, so we've looked at all these different struggles, from peaceful marches to Soviet tanks to global terrorism and the state's reaction. So what's the big picture here? After 100 years of this, what are the big lessons we can pull from it all?
Well, first off, it's pretty clear that the whole century was this constant battle between established power and the people who challenged it. Second, leaders like Gandhi, King, and Mandela showed us that nonviolence isn't a weakness. It can be a powerful, strategic weapon for change. Third, we saw the tragic lesson that when people feel like they have no other options, some will turn to violence. And finally, we learned that when a state responds with pure brute force, it often just makes the conflict worse, creating a vicious cycle.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. As we watch new movements for change spring up all over the world today, which of these lessons from the last 100 years are the most important? What can we learn from the incredible successes of nonviolence, the awful tragedies of extremism, and this complicated dance between power and resistance that truly shaped the world we live in now?